Hi, I'm Tonia Ransom. I'm the creator and executive producer of Nightlight, a podcast that features creepy tales written by Black writers all over the world. And today I'm here to talk to you about the science of mermaids and sirens. So let's talk a little bit about what the differences are between mermaids and sirens because a lot of people confuse them to be the same creature. In fact, pictures of sirens and mermaids, if you were to do a Google search, they look pretty much the same, but they're actually two distinctly different creatures. So first, let's talk a little bit about their similarities. First, they're both hybrid creatures, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute, but this just means that they're basically half human and then half some other animal. They also all lure sailors to their deaths. There's been a lot of mythology written about both sirens and mermaids, luring sailors either with their beauty or with their song and then killing them. And we'll talk a little bit about how they kill later on in the presentation. Finally, they're both prevalent in multiple mythologies all across the world, but they have their roots in Greek mythology. Now, that's not to say that Greek mythology is what created sirens and mermaids. In fact, mermaids, the first mention of a mermaid is actually in Syrian mythology, but Greek mythology is kind of what made them popular and helped them enter into world literature and other mythologies over time. So a little bit about the differences between mermaids and sirens. First of all, mermaids are the thing that you usually see when you search for a mermaid or a siren. They're half woman, so woman on the top, and then they have the lower body of the fish. They have that long flowing tail and they sit on the rocks and they sun themselves, that sort of thing. They're also known for their beauty. They're supposed to be very, very beautiful and attract men that are sailors or on the sea, whatever the reason, men can't resist their beauty. Now, sirens are a little bit different. They also have the upper body of a woman, but they have the lower body of a bird. And so in this sense, they resemble harpies a lot, actually. They have wings in addition to human arms, and we'll talk a little bit about their skeletal structure later on. But they aren't necessarily known for their beauty. Their enchantment comes from their song. Now, the thing about mermaids and sirens and harpies is over time, they've all kind of gotten conflated with one another. So a lot of times when people say siren, they really mean a mermaid, or they'll say that mermaids have this siren song that they can sing to sailors to help attract them to their little rocks so that they can kill them. But again, they are distinctly separate creatures. And they've changed over time. Mermaids have remained pretty static. They've always been upper body of a woman, lower body of a fish. But sirens originally started off with just the head of a human, and then the rest of their body was a bird. Greek mythology also had them starting off as women, and then they were given wings. And we'll talk a little bit about this in just a second about why that happened. They were given wings, and then they were cursed to have the lower body of a bird. So there's a little bit of confusion as exactly how sirens came to have the shape that they have. But at this point, it's pretty much agreed upon that mermaids have the upper body of a woman, lower body of a fish. Sirens are going to have the upper body of a woman and the lower body of a bird, and they're going to have wings. Harpies pretty much look the same as sirens. They just kill a little bit differently, and it's really just by shrieking. Sirens are a little bit different than harpies. Okay, so let's talk about mermaids. I actually like sirens better, so we're going to start with mermaids so that we can end with my favorite. So Mermaid Basics, again, all mermaids lure sailors to their deaths with their beauty. That's how they enchant those sailors to come to them so that they can drown them or devour them, depending on the mythology that you want to listen to and whether or not the mermaids are actually hungry or they just want to be mean. Depending on the mythology, they can represent both good fortune or they can represent disaster. More than likely, most mythology is going to have them leaning toward, if you see them, it's an omen for some sort of disaster, meaning that if you are on the seas and you are a sailor and you happen to see a mermaid, then you should take that as a warning that there are going to be rough seas ahead, even if the mermaids don't mess with you at all. However, because they came also from Syrian mythology, where they were designed more to represent fertility and abundance, there's also this sort of conflation of, oh, they can also represent good fortune. And that's in mythologies across the world. So African mermaids also can represent good fortune. Actually, in Japan, they are predominantly good creatures versus bad creatures with malicious intent. So it depends on which mythology you're looking at, whether or not you should be afraid of a mermaid or whether you should welcome their presence. Um, Mermaids are not inherently murderous. They are content to just sit on their island in the sun and bask in the sun, swim in the waters, have fun, live carefree. Um, and if they see a sailor, they may just ignore them. They're not inherently murderous. But if they're very hungry or they're just in a bad mood, then they're going to use their beauty to lure that sailor to his death. One thing that I find really interesting is that mythologies have mermaids living in both saltwater and freshwater. We often don't think about mermaids living in anything but saltwater. They are sea creatures in most of our minds. But the reality is that mythologies across the world also have them living in freshwater, which I think is super interesting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mermaid anatomy. And if you came to my talk at Multiverse last year, you know that anatomy and biology are my favorite things in the world. So I'm stoked to get to talk about mermaid anatomy and their skeletons, and that I found this really cool picture that this guy drew that kind of details what the skeletal structure of a mermaid would look like. So again, a mermaid is human on their upper body. So they have a human skeleton for their upper body. So they're going to have the human skull. They're going to have a rib cage shape just like ours. The difference is that they're going to have a little bit of a modified hip structure. Now, again, if you came to my talk last year about werewolves, you'll know that hip structure is really important for walking upright, which is why werewolves can't have canine hip structure, because canines can't walk upright because of their hip structure. Now, mermaids have tails, they don't have legs, so they don't need the hip structure that a human necessarily has. Now, if you have a mythology where a mermaid can get legs, then that mermaid is going to have to either undergo a transformation before she gets her legs, or mermaids inherently are going to have a human hip structure in order to be able to walk once they gain those legs. Now, this is where a lot of mythologies start to diverge and become a little bit different, but the fin structure can be on their hips. So if you see a picture of a mermaid and you see fins flowing off of the sides of their hips, they're going to need some bone structure to support those. They're also going to have them on the radius, so that's your arm bone, the one that's on the side of your thumb. And then so they can have fins growing off the side of their arm on the side with their thumb is usually where it would be, and it would help them with swimming. Now, most pictures of mermaids have them with a completely human upper body, meaning that there are no fins on their arms, but you do see some mythologies where there are fins on their arms, and so there would have to be some skeletal structure that comes off of the radius in order for that to happen. Now, the big difference between a human skeleton and a mermaid skeleton is that mermaids are going to have that extended spine, just like a fish. They're going to have their upper body, they're going to have their rib cage to protect all of their vital organs, but then after that, it's just spine all the way to the end where it bifurcates into a tail. So, of course, you have traditional spinal structure. We have 7 cervical vertebrae, those are the ones in your neck. And then we have 12 thoracic vertebrae, those are the ones that your ribs come off of. And then we have 5 lumbar vertebrae. And then you have your tailbone, your coccyx. Mermaids are not going to have that coccyx in the way that we have it. They're going to have an extended lumbar spine because their lower back, the shape of their body is going to go much lower as far as their spine goes. So they're going to have more lumbar vertebrae than we do, but then they're going to terminate in this sort of smaller vertebrae. If you notice that those vertebrae get a lot smaller as they get to the end, so they're going to more resemble something like thoracic or cervical vertebrae. So think of it like taking your spine, copy pasting it, and then reversing it is what it would look like. The other distinct difference between a fish and a mermaid is that there's no dorsal fin on mermaids. There are almost no pictures of mermaids that have a fin on their back. Almost all fish do have a fin on their back. So they have a fin structure that comes off of their spines on their back, whereas mermaids are not going to have that necessarily. Okay, so let's talk about how mermaids kill. All right, so mermaids lure sailors with their beauty, right? But we need a scientific basis for that. Is it really just that they're so pretty that the sailors just can't keep themselves away? Or is it possible that mermaids emit more pheromones than the average woman does? Now, we all emit pheromones in our sweat in particular. There are other ways as well, but sweat is the primary way that other humans perceive pheromones in other humans, okay? So there have been studies that show that the scent of an ovulating woman increases testosterone in men. So what they did is they took t-shirts that women had worn and they tracked whether they were ovulating or whether it was pre-ovulation or whether they were menstruating, and had men smell these t-shirts. So can you imagine, by the way, like being one of these guys, it's like, I'm going to participate in the study, and they're like, here, smell this sweaty t-shirt. It would be super weird, I think, but I digress. So they had these men smell these t-shirts and rate the attractiveness of the woman based on the t-shirt. Okay, so they couldn't see the women at all. The only experience that they had with this woman was sniffing her t-shirt. And women who were ovulating, when they sniffed those t-shirts, they found that men not only found those women more attractive, but it also increased the testosterone levels in men. Now, women also have this, even though we're kind of focused on mermaids and not mermen, but theoretically mermen would work the same sort of way. It's just a different pheromone than what women emit, obviously. And the thing is also that you have to keep in mind is that women's attraction to men is also based on where they are in their menstrual cycle. So if they're ovulating, they're going to be more attracted to men. But again, it's more of the testosterone that the men might be emitting that makes them more attractive a partner than someone else, for instance. There's also some evidence that there's a genetic diversity component to pheromone attraction, meaning that the more different your genetics are from a different sex partner that you can reproduce with, the more likely you are to be attracted to them. So it's not just the pheromones. There's something else that is in our scent that hints at, are we a good pair to reproduce, or are our genes too similar? And that could potentially cause problems for our offspring. So I think that mermaids attract these sailors with their pheromones. So this means mermaids have to sweat a lot. They don't have to be pouring sweat. You know, we could say that their pheromones are just more concentrated than a normal human's would be. So they're going to have a different biological component. Perhaps the glands that are in their brains that help produce or help get our bodies to produce these pheromones are a little bit larger because they create more of these pheromones than the average person does. Another study showed that menstrual cycles of women either slowed or accelerated when they were exposed to other women's sweat. So it's not just a different sex partner that we respond to. We also respond to each other. So if men are around other men with more testosterone, then they feel more competitive, which is why a lot of men and make stupid decisions. This is, this joke of, if you get 3 men together, then their IQ drops by 20 points kind of thing. That's exactly why. It's because of the testosterone, there's a feeling that there needs to be some sort of competition for the mating process. And it's not a conscious thing. It's not that they're being stupid or anything. It's just that there's a biological basis for, I have more testosterone. There is more testosterone around me. That makes me less likely to be able to produce offspring with my genes. So I need to compete with these other men to make sure that my genes are the ones that move on and not these other guys. Okay, so once the mermaids emit all of their pheromones and the wind carries it across the sea to these sailors and lures them in, that is when the mermaid captures their kill and then drags them down into the depths to drown them. Drowning is the typical way that mermaids kill their prey, although they can be very violent and devour their prey alive. Okay, so let's talk about sirens, because I think sirens are way more interesting than mermaids are. So a little bit about sirens. Again, they lure sailors to their deaths just like mermaids, but they do it with their song instead of with their beauty. They have to sing in order to lure those sailors in. They don't have the beauty or the pheromones to lure those men into their island. They almost always across mythology have malicious they almost always have malicious intent, meaning that they might be hanging out on their island and they see a ship sailing by and they think, let's kill those guys. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second, why that might be. Okay, so the mythology is that these were women who were basically handmaidens to Persephone. And when Hades captured Persephone and took her to the underworld, Demeter gave them wings so that they could find Persephone. Obviously, Demeter didn't know that Persephone was in the underworld. Otherwise, they would know the wings wouldn't help. But they were granted wings to help search for Persephone. Of course, because Persephone was in the underworld with Hades, uh, the sirens failed at their mission, and so then they were cursed with their bird lower halves because they failed. They could no longer be women or women with wings. They now became these cursed creatures that lived in two different worlds, both bird and human. Now, this is where the malicious intent thing comes in. A lot of times it's explained that sirens are more malicious and violent than mermaids because they're angry about the way that they were treated by these Greek gods. Basically, they took care of Persephone. They hunted for her, tried to find her, tried to save her, but she was in a place that they couldn't get to. And so they were cursed unfairly. And so now they're taking it out on humanity in the form of sailors. Okay, so let's talk about Siren Anatomy again, my favorite thing to talk about. Okay, so again, there's a human skeleton for their upper body. They're going to have a skull just like we do. Regardless of what myth you're looking at, they always have a human head. Now, depending on the mythology that you're looking at, they could have a bird body from the neck down, basically. So obviously this particular graphic would not apply. Now, most mythology actually has them with a human body, a human upper body in its entirety, so not just from the neck up. So that's why we're showing this. But they also have wings. Now, the thing about wings is that they require different skeletal structure to support it, and it's not just the actual wings themselves. If you were to look at any bird versus a human, you would see that the rib cage, especially in the front, like the breastbone part, is going to be bigger. And that's because they need support for all of those muscles that are used to power the flight using their wings. So the rib cage structure is going to be different. Even though they have that human upper body, the rib cage is going to resemble that more of a bird to support the wings and flight. Okay. They're also going to have the narrow hip structure of a bird because that's kind of when that transition point happens, is right underneath that rib cage is when they start to have that bird-like structure. They have the bird hips, they have bird legs, and then they have the claws on the bottom of their feet like birds do. Oh, let's go back for a second though. Because one thing that we want to think about is that typically if you were to look at a bird skeleton, you would see that their clavicles in the front are kind of extended, and that's where a lot of their structure is tied to for their wings. Now, humans have arms, right? And our clavicles are what allow us to kind of move our arms around like this. Now, if we have wings and arms, that presents a little bit of a problem because we lose some mobility. So if you notice in this particular diagram, the artist has posited that the wings are actually attached more to the back, and that there's an additional structure in the shoulders that creates the basis and the foundation for those wings. Okay, now we can talk about how sirens kill. So I posit that they kill with sound. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of research out there about how humans experience sound. We know that sirens kill with their song, and it's supposed to be a beautiful song that lures sailors in and brings them to the sirens so that they can then kill them. Now, I think that because it's not necessarily because their song is so enchanting that they're killed. Now, the enchantment of the song and the beauty of the way that they sing could lure sailors in, but the way that they actually kill is they use sound as well. So they can use their vocal cords to create really high decibel sounds with low frequencies. That's the key. So think back to when you were in school and you learned about volcanic eruptions. You probably learned about an explosion of a volcano called Krakatoa. Okay. There's a theory, and it's pretty much been proven, that when that particular volcano exploded, the sound waves circled the earth at least twice. because that's how far they could go, because they were at a lower frequency. Lower frequency sounds can go a lot farther. They can penetrate our bodies. They can change our bodies. So we need about 150 decibels to burst our eardrums. So that's quite loud. That's pretty much like a jet engine. You're standing right under a jet engine and they start it and boom, your eardrums burst. In addition, like any sort of explosives would create that high of a decibel sound. Now, again, the deadliness comes not just from how loud the sound is, but how low the frequency of that sound is. So think of it this way. You're in a car, you're listening to music, there's a lot of bass in the song. It shakes the car, like you can feel the bass in your body because it's a lower frequency sound. Whereas if you were listening to something with higher notes, you don't feel those vibrations in your body. Now, that low frequency is what allows those sound waves to penetrate our bodies more easily. The high decibel level increases the amount of damage done by those frequencies. Okay, does that make sense? So they actually did a study. I think it was the Army or the Navy. I can't remember exactly which one, but there was a study that was done that showed that exposure to infrasound, which is low frequency sound. So infrasound means sound that is too low of a frequency for us to hear. So again, you can have low frequency sounds with high decibels. It's just that our ears aren't attuned to that particular frequency, and so we can't hear it. It's not that there's not a decibel level there, it's just that we're incapable of perceiving it, okay? But there was a study done that showed that when people were exposed to infrasound at over 110 decibels, it caused dizziness and blood pressure and respiratory changes. The authors of the study even posited that given the right frequency and the right decibel level, that they could inflate and deflate lungs with sound waves alone. Okay. Now, they obviously have not done a study to see when organs would burst. So this is all just theory. But the idea is that just based on what we know about how infrasound works at lower decibel levels and how sound that we can hear works at higher decibel levels, that it would take about 170 to 200 decibels to start to burst your organs. In particular, your lungs are going to be the most susceptible because there's a lot of air in there. Sound waves can travel really well through there. But again, this is how explosives kill, even if you were not necessarily in the immediate blast radius. It's the shock wave from the explosives that actually kill a lot of people. And it's because those shock waves are sound waves, and those sound waves disrupt all kinds of things in our body, particularly, again, our lungs, which we kind of need to breathe and live. So basically, sirens are like really soothing sounding grenades. So they lure you in and sing you a lullaby, and then they pull the pin and boom, you're dead, is how I think that they would kill scientifically. So I hope that you learned something useful or interesting in this talk. If you want more weirdness, I talk about it all the time online. You can follow me on Twitter at Mystifying or at Nightlight Pod. I'm on Instagram at Mystifying. I'm also on Instagram at Nightlight Pod, but that's more podcast related content. You're obviously welcome to follow my podcast. I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/Tonia Thompson Writer. So if you have any questions about anything I said, or if you want to challenge anything that I said, like I would love it if someone would challenge some of the things that I said, or if you want to work on these theories some more, posit your own theories and have a discussion with me about it, I welcome that and I would love it. Reach out to me on social media so that we can chat. Thank you so much. I hope that you're enjoying Multiverse. Have a great day.